Section 18 of Confessions, volumes 3 and 4. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Confessions, volumes 3 and 4, by Jean Jacques Rousseau. Anonymously translated. Section 18. I remained at Lyon 7 or 8 days to wait for some little commissions with which Madame de Warrens had charged Mademoiselle du Châtelet, who during this interval I visited more assiduously than before, having the pleasure of talking with her of her friend, and being no longer disturbed by the cruel remembrance of my situation, or painful endeavors to conceal it. Mademoiselle du Châtelet was neither young nor handsome, but did not want for elegance. She was easy and obliging, while her understanding gave price to her familiarity. She had a taste for that kind of moral observation which leads to the knowledge of mankind, and from her originated that study in myself. She was fond of the works of Le Sage, particularly Gil Blas, which she lent me, and recommended to my perusal. I read this performance with pleasure, but my judgment was not yet ripe enough to relish that sort of reading. I liked romances which abounded with high-flown sentiments. Thus did I pass my time at the grate of Mademoiselle du Châtelet, with as much profit as pleasure. It is certain that the interesting and sensible conversation of a deserving woman is more proper to form the understanding of a young man than all the pedantic philosophy of books. I got acquainted at the Chassat with some other boarders and their friends, and among the rest with a young person of 14, called Mademoiselle Serre, whom I did not much notice at that time, though I was in love with her 8 or 9 years afterwards, and with great reason, for she was a most charming girl. I was fully occupied with the idea of seeing Madame de Warrens, and this gave some respite to my chimeras, for finding happiness in real objects, I was the less inclined to seek it in non-entities. I had not only found her, but also by her means, and near her, an agreeable situation, she having sent me word that she had procured one that would suit me, and by which I should not be obliged to quit her. I exhausted all my conjectures in guessing what this occupation could be, but I must have possessed the art of divination to have hit it on the right. I had money sufficient to make my journey agreeable. Mademoiselle du Châtelet persuaded me to hire a horse, but this I could not consent to. And I was certainly right, for by so doing I should have lost the pleasure of the last pedestrian expedition I ever made, for I cannot give that name to those excursions I have frequently taken about my own neighborhood while I lived at Moutier. It is very singular that my imagination never rises so high as when my situation is least agreeable or cheerful. When everything smiles around me, I am least amused. My heart cannot confine itself to realities, cannot embellish, but must create. Real objects strike me as they really are. My imagination can only decorate ideal ones. If I would paint the spring, it must be in winter. If I describe a beautiful landscape, it must be while surrounded with walls. And I have said 100 times that were I confined in the Bastille, I could draw the most enchanting picture of liberty. On my departure from Lyon, I saw nothing but an agreeable future. The content I now with reason enjoyed was as great as my discontent had been at leaving Paris. Notwithstanding, I had not during this journey any of those delightful reveries I then enjoyed. My mind was serene, and that was all. I drew near the excellent friend I was going to see, my heart overflowing with tenderness, enjoying in advance, but without intoxication, the pleasure of living near her. I had always expected this, and it was as if nothing new had happened. Meantime, I was anxious about the employment Madame de Warrens had procured me, as if that alone had been material. My ideas were calm and peaceable, not ravishing and celestial. Every object struck my sight in its natural form. I observed the surrounding landscape, remarked the trees, the houses, the springs, deliberated on the crossroads, was fearful of losing myself, yet did not do so. In a word, I was no longer in the Empyrean, but precisely where I found myself, or sometimes, perhaps, at the end of my journey, never farther. I am, in recounting my travels, as I was in making them, loath to arrive at the conclusion. My heart beat with joy as I approached my dear Madame de Warrens, but I went no faster on that account. I love to walk at my ease and stop at leisure. A strolling life is necessary to me. Travelling on foot in a fine country, with fine weather, and having an agreeable object to terminate my journey, is the manner of living of all others most suited to my taste. It is already understood what I mean by a fine country. Never can a flat one, though ever so beautiful, appear such in my eyes. I must have torrents, fir trees, black woods, mountains to climb or descend, and rugged roads with precipices on either side to alarm me. I experienced this pleasure in its utmost extent as I approached Chambéry, not far from a mountain which is called Pas de l'Echelle. Above the main road, which is hewn through the rock, a small river runs and rushes into fearful chasms, which it appears to have been millions of ages in forming. The road has been hedged by a parapet to prevent accidents, which enabled me to contemplate the whole descent and gain vertigos at pleasure; for a great part of my amusement in these steep rocks is they cause a giddiness and swimming in my head, which I am particularly fond of, provided I am in safety. Leaning therefore over the parapet, I remained whole hours, catching from time to time a glance of the froth and blue water, whose rushing caught my ear, mingled with the cries of ravens and other birds of prey that flew from rock to rock and bush to bush at 600 feet below me. In places where the slope was tolerably regular, and clear enough from bushes to let stones roll freely, I went a considerable way to gather them, bringing those I could but just carry, which I piled on the parapet and then threw down, one after the other, being transported at seeing them roll, rebound, and fly into 1,000 pieces, before they reached the bottom of the precipice. Near Chambéry I enjoyed an equally pleasing spectacle, though of a different kind. The road passing near the foot of the most charming cascade I ever saw. The water, which is very rapid, shoots from the top of an excessively steep mountain, falling at such a distance from its base that you may walk between the cascade and the rock without any inconvenience. But if not particularly careful, it is easy to be deceived as I was, for the water, falling from such an immense height, separates and descends in a rain as fine as dust, and on approaching too near this cloud, without perceiving it, you may be wet through in an instant. At length I arrived at Madame de Warrens. She was not alone, the Intendant General was with her. Without speaking a word to me, she caught my hand, and presenting me to him with that natural grace which charmed all hearts, said: "This, sir, is the poor young man I mentioned. Deign to protect him as long as he deserves it, and I shall feel no concern for the remainder of his life." Then added, addressing herself to me: "Child, you now belong to the King. Thank Monsieur the Intendant, who furnishes you with the means of existence." I stared without answering, without knowing what to think of all this. Rising ambition almost turned my head. I was already prepared to act the intendant myself. My fortune, however, was not so brilliant as I had imagined, but it was sufficient to maintain me, which, as I was situated, was a capital acquisition. I shall now explain the nature of my employment. King Victor Amadé, judging from the event of preceding wars, and the situation of the ancient patrimony of his fathers, that he should no longer be able to maintain it, wished to drain it beforehand. Resolving therefore to tax the nobility, he ordered a general survey of the whole country, in order that it might be rendered more equal and productive. This scheme, which was begun under the father, was completed by the son. 200 or 300 men, part surveyors, who were called geometricians, and part writers, who were called secretaries, were employed in this work. Among those of the latter description, Madame de Warrens had got me appointed. This post, without being very lucrative, furnished the means of living eligibly in that country. The misfortune was, this employment could not be of any great duration, but it put me in train to procure something better, as by this means she hoped to insure the particular protection of the intendant, who might find me some more settled occupation before this was concluded. I entered on my new employment a few days after my arrival, and as there was no great difficulty in the business, soon understood it. Thus, after 4 or 5 years of unsettled life, folly, and suffering, since my departure from Geneva, I began for the first time to gain my bread with credit. These long details of my early youth must have appeared trifling, and I am sorry for it. Though born a man, in a variety of instances I was long a child, and am so yet in many particulars. I did not promise the public a great personage. I promised to describe myself as I am, and to know me in my advanced age it was necessary to have known me in my youth. As in general, objects that are present make less impression on me than the bare remembrance of them, my ideas being all from recollection, the first traits which were engraven on my mind have distinctly remained. Those which have since been imprinted there have rather combined with the former than effaced them. There is a certain yet varied succession of affections and ideas which continue to regulate those that follow them, and this progression must be known in order to judge rightly of those they have influenced. I have studied to develop the first causes, the better to show the concatenation of effects. I would be able by some means to render my soul transparent to the eyes of the reader, and for this purpose endeavor to show it in every possible point of view, to give him every insight, and act in such a manner that not a motion should escape him, as by this means he may form a judgment of the principles that produce them. Did I take upon myself to decide and say to the reader, "Such is my character," he might think that if I did not endeavor to deceive him, I at least deceived myself. But in recounting simply all that has happened to me, all my actions, thoughts, and feelings, I cannot lead him into an error, unless I do it wilfully, which by this means I could not easily effect, since it is his province to compare the elements and judge of the being they compose. Thus the result must be his work, and if he is then deceived, the error will be his own. It is not sufficient for this purpose that my recitals should be merely faithful, they must also be minute. It is not for me to judge of the importance of facts, I ought to declare them simply as they are, and leave the estimate that is to be formed of them to him. I have adhered to this principle hitherto with the most scrupulous exactitude, and shall not depart from it in the continuation. But the impressions of age are less lively than those of youth. I began by delineating the latter. Should I recollect the rest with the same precision, the reader may perhaps become weary and impatient, but I shall not be dissatisfied with my labor. I have but one thing to apprehend in this undertaking. I do not dread saying too much, or advancing falsities, but I am fearful of not saying enough, or concealing truths. End of section 18. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. End of Confessions, volumes 3 and 4, by Jean Jacques Rousseau, anonymously translated.